Hey everyone! Look who's here, Mr. Low Education. Mike's obnoxious voice echoed through the reunion hall. He was practically shouting, mocking me as loudly as he could. Our former classmates began turning to see what was happening. I couldn't understand why Mike remained so unpleasant just as he was back in the day, and frankly I didn't want to understand. I could only sigh in frustration. Seeing no reaction from me, Mike's taunts escalated. A guy like you with a low education doesn't belong to this reunion. What are you even doing here? Even I couldn't stay silent any longer with his insults to me. It was time to tell Mike the real reason why I attended this reunion. I decided to finally speak up. Suddenly, Mike, who had been so full of himself, started trembling and collapsed to his knees. My name is Thomas, and I'm 33 years old. Currently, I work as an investigator for a small detective agency. I've always admired my father, who worked as a police officer. He was assigned to patrol duty, often engaging with the community and participating in service activities. Therefore, my father was a police officer loved by everyone. My mother supported him, and we lived happily as a family. My father always told me that if I wanted to become a police officer, I had to study hard, so I did. As a result, I was able to pass the entrance exam for a prestigious private middle school. I vowed to work even harder to become a police officer like my father, but then something happened on the day of the entrance ceremony. Since my father was at work, I attended the ceremony with my mother. There were many luxury cars parked in front of the school gate. While I was astonished by the sight, a boy and his mother, likely there for the ceremony as well, got out of one of the cars. The boy looked at me with a smirk. His mother then approached my mother. "Lisa, it's been so long. I didn't know they'd end up at the same middle school. Can you afford such an expensive school?" The boy's mother sounded condescending. My mother, unfazed, replied with a smile, "Yes, it's for my son's dream. We'll manage just fine. I don't want to be at the same school as you. Don't bother me too much." The boy glared at me. His mother told her son while laughing, "Don't worry, you probably won't have to interact with poor people like them." My mother responded to the spiteful pair with, "I look forward to the years ahead." She looked sad, though. The boy's mother snickered and walked away with her son. "What unpleasant people." I whispered to my mother, "Do you know those people? They seem really awful." My mother looked at me with a wry smile. "The boy's father is your father's colleague. You've met them before, but you probably don't remember. That boy's name is Mike." I didn't remember Mike at all. What? How can someone who's also a police officer like Dad look down on us like that? As I wasn't able to comprehend, I pressed my mother for an explanation. She looked troubled. "He used to be a much nicer person." And then, she began to tell me about the unpleasant Mike and his family. Mike's father had entered the police academy at the same time as my father and became a police officer. During their training period, they were good friends and often hung out together. But a few years later, my father chose to work at a local police station to engage with the community, while Mike's father chose to become a detective. At first, our families remained close, but gradually we drifted apart. My father had become a police officer with just a high school diploma, while Mike's father graduated from a prestigious college and worked as an elite detective. As they continued in their careers, they no longer had much in common. Mike's father earned a significantly higher salary than my father, and Mike's mother's personality changed dramatically. As my mother sadly explained, "Can money really change a person's character?" I listened intently to my mother's story. "You must never judge people by their money or status, Thomas. Promise me you'll never be like that," my mother said, looking me in the eye. At that moment, I vowed never to become like Mike's family. I decided to avoid Mike as much as possible in middle school. After the entrance ceremony, I walked into the classroom with that resolve. My mother and I were both shocked. Mike was seated right next to me. This must be some kind of cruel joke. I cursed my luck. Mike looked at me with a disgusted expression. "You've got to be kidding. Having a poor kid like you next to me is going to make it impossible to concentrate." I wanted to throw those words right back at him. I didn't want to sit next to him either. Then, as if joining in on Mike's taunts, his mother said, "Thomas, don't you dare interfere with my son." Did they both just want to look down on me? I was too stunned to respond. My first day of middle school turned out to be a nightmare. On the way home, my mother looked at me with concern. "Do you think you can get along with Mike?" After thinking for a moment, I replied, "I don't think we'll be friends, but I'll try not to get involved with him too much." My mother looked slightly relieved. In truth, I never wanted to have anything to do with such rude people again, but being in the same class, I had no choice. Still, I was filled with anxiety about my new life in middle school. And my fears came true. The next day, my worried mother saw me off to school. When I arrived, I found Mike's belongings on my desk. Mike was chatting happily with other classmates. This is my seat," I said hesitantly to Mike. But he ignored me, even though I was sure he heard me. I spoke even louder to him again. "Hey! This is my seat." Mike turned to me with a smirk. "Oops, my bad. I thought your seat was for storing my stuff," he said mockingly and began to remove his things from my desk. I was filled with anger. However, causing a scene here would only make things worse. I tried so hard to keep my emotions in check. Mike laughed at me and walked away. I could only sigh. The thought of spending 3 years with someone like him was suffocating. Could I really get through this? I felt increasingly anxious. Just then, a classmate approached my desk and started talking to me. "Mike was giving you a hard time already. Don't mind him. He's always like that." It was Jacob, who sat behind me. He had graduated from the same elementary school as Mike and told me that Mike had bullied him in the past, too. He's always bragging about his wealth and making everyone else feel small. Jacob stood up for me. From that point on, Mike continued to hurl insults at me, but Jacob always had my back, making my time in middle school more bearable. My middle school had a high school attached, so inevitably, Mike and I ended up in the same high school. But with friends who supported me, I wasn't as worried. By the time we reached senior year, I was unsure about my future path. I wondered if I should go to college to become a police officer like my father. My father had become a police officer with just a high school diploma. If I were to follow in his footsteps, I wouldn't need to go to college. Even if you want to be a police officer, having a good education is important. "I want you to go to college," my mother insisted. My father, in contrast, said, "Thomas, it's your life. Do what you want. Your mother and I will support whatever decision you make." Hearing this from my father, I decided not to go to college. "Thomas, you're not going to college?" Jacob asked with wide-eyed. I explained that I wanted to become a police officer like my father and would take the exam after high school. Jacob, surprised but supportive, said, "Wow, Thomas. That's awesome. Good luck." Then a familiar and unpleasant voice interrupted. "Not going to college? You just don't want to study, do you? You'll never become a police officer. Stop joking around." Mike's words stung. I knew I wasn't exceptionally smart or athletic. I was well aware that I might not become a police officer. Hearing it from Mike made it even more painful. Seeing this, Jacob raised his voice in my defense. "Mike, that's too much. You don't know if he can make it until he tries." "What, can you see the future now?" Mike snorted at Jacob's words. "There's no way a scrawny guy like him can be a police officer. If people like him become one, we're doomed. Jacob, you should choose your friends more wisely. Thomas is my best friend. And I doubt you have anyone you'd call a friend. Your personality is the reason why." Jacob grabbed my arm and led me away from Mike. I was deeply moved by Jacob's words. "I consider you my best friend too, Jacob. I'll work hard for the police exam. I'll prove Mike wrong." Jacob smiled and nodded yes. However, my dream quickly crumbled. Despite my efforts, I failed the police exam. I was devastated, and the tears wouldn't stop. Seeing this, my father said gently, "There are many ways to help people besides being a police officer. Failing one exam isn't the end. You're full of potential." My father always knew the right thing to say. I respected him deeply. As expected, Mike belittled me even more when he found out I hadn't passed the police exam. I knew you were useless. I had no retort. On the day of my high school graduation, I left the school as if I were fleeing. I didn't want to hear anything more from Mike. After graduating, I believed I would never have to see the annoying Mike again. I was convinced of that. After graduation, I followed my father's advice and searched for a job where I could help others. That's when I found a small detective agency. Being a detective involves investigating on behalf of clients who are troubled. I thought this could be a way for me to help people. With this in mind, I went for an interview. The person who interviewed me was Mary, the female director of the agency. I passionately explained my reasons for wanting the job, and Mary hired me on the spot. At first, my parents were surprised that I took a job at a detective agency, but now they support me. I joined the agency with no experience in detective work, but Mary patiently taught me everything, and I quickly became competent at my job. 15 years later, I had become proficient in my work. One day, a woman named Jessica came to our agency for a consultation. I think my fiancé might be cheating on me. Could you investigate? Jessica spoke with tears in her eyes, looking very sad. More than half of the people who come to our agency seek help with infidelity investigations. They all have sad expressions on their faces. Somehow, I want to make them smile. I always conduct my research with that feeling in mind. I understand. I will investigate thoroughly. Hearing my words, Jessica began to cry. No matter the outcome, I just want to know the truth. Thank you, Thomas. She said this while gripping my hand. I couldn't stand the thought of someone betraying such a wonderful woman. Determined to resolve this case, I began the investigation. Being a detective is not easy. I gather as much information as possible about the subject, stake out, conduct interviews, and sometimes go undercover depending on the situation. My work hours are irregular, with early mornings and late nights. But I never found it burdensome. The gratitude I received from clients at the end of an investigation made it all worthwhile. I planned to start the stakeout on Jessica's fiancé the next day. However, when I woke up, my mother looked distressed. Thomas. I think I've thrown out my back. It hurts so much I can't stand up. She was clutching her back in pain. My father works at the police station, so he can't take time off. I contacted Mary and decided to take my mother to the hospital that day. Despite her back pain, I managed to get my mother into the car and headed to the orthopedic clinic. My mother had always been healthy and had never needed to go to the hospital before. Therefore, I visited an orthopedic clinic I found on the internet. The clinic was very clean and well maintained. I helped my mother to a sofa in the waiting room and completed the registration. In no time, my mother's name was called, and I accompanied her to the examination room. To my shock, the doctor was none other than Mike. My mother was equally stunned, her eyes wide with surprise. Thomas. As soon as Mike saw me, he exclaimed in surprise. Mike. I didn't know you were a doctor here. When I said this, Mike started laughing. While you were messing around with just a high school diploma, I was studying hard and graduated from medical school. Thanks to my abilities, I became a doctor and even own my own clinic. It's not too late for you to start studying, Thomas. My mother and I were both stunned by Mike's words. Even after 15 years, Mike hadn't changed at all. Feeling bewildered, I watched as Mike began examining my mother with the efficiency of a conveyor belt. During the examination, he continued to make condescending remarks towards me. You didn't become a police officer because you're incompetent. If you were as talented as I am, things would be different. Even the nurse in the examination room looked shocked by his comments. Both my mother and I just wanted to leave the clinic as quickly as possible. After the examination, we rushed out of the room, only to hear Mike and the nurse laughing behind us. That guy? He was my classmate, but he's just a high school graduate. Can you believe it? Unbelievable. I was seething with anger. What's so bad about being a high school graduate? I wasn't causing any harm to anyone. My body began to shake with rage. Seeing my state, my mother whispered, Thomas, calm down. That man is a terrible person. It's not worth your time to respond to him. people like him will get a bad karma eventually. Bad karma, yes.
I hoped Mike would get what he deserved. After settling the bill, I returned home with a heavy heart.
Before entering the house, I checked the mailbox and found a postcard inside. My name was written on the address. A postcard for me? Curiously, I opened it and saw it was an invitation to a middle school reunion. It was also accompanied by a note that we hope you will join us. A reunion. I had mixed feelings about it. Mike would likely be there. Who knows what he'd say this time? The memory of Mike's behavior at the clinic flashed through my mind. Just then, my phone rang. Hello?
Jacob.
It's been a while. What's up?
It was a call from Jacob after a long time. Even after graduating high school, I kept in touch with Jacob a few times a year. He sounded excited on the phone.
You got the reunion invitation, right? You're coming, right? Hearing his words, I felt conflicted.
I want to, but Mike will probably be there, and I'm not sure if I want to deal with that.
Jacob, however, was adamant about convincing me. Don't let that stop you.
The reunion is at that fancy hotel.
Let's have some good drinks and reminisce. All right, I'll go. With Jacob's enthusiastic persuasion, I decided to attend the reunion.
Even though I had decided, my heart wasn't in it.
I really didn't want to see Mike again.
Nevertheless, the day of the reunion was approaching fast.
I even took the day off work for it. Mary smiled and said, "Enjoy your reunion. Have a great time," but honestly, I wasn't looking forward to it. On the morning of the reunion, I reluctantly started getting ready.
My mother, concerned, had bought me a new shirt for the occasion, so I put it on. It was the first time since becoming an adult that my mother had bought me clothes.
You look great. Walk into that reunion with confidence. Don't let Mike get to you.
She looked me straight in the eye as she said this. Though my mother had always maintained a calm demeanor in front of Mike, every time he said something cruel to me, it broke her heart.
Don't worry, Mom. There's no way I'll let Mike beat me. That's right.
With my mother seeing me off, I left the house and headed to the fancy hotel where the reunion was being held. When I arrived and entered the restaurant, many of my former classmates were already there.
Jacob spotted me and eagerly approached. Hey! Glad you made it. Let's have some good drinks and catch up. He handed me a glass of wine. As we toasted, I noticed some commotion at the back of the restaurant.
I looked over and saw Mike standing with a beautiful woman.
Mike was introducing her to our classmates. This is my fiancée, Rachel. She's the daughter of the director of T Hospital. We're getting married soon.
And her father is going to invest a lot of money into my clinic.
My clinic is going to expand even more, Mike boasted to our classmates.
They looked at him with envy, amazed that he was marrying such a beautiful and wealthy woman.
I quickly turned my attention back to Jacob. I thought nothing good would come from being involved with Mike.
But Mike soon noticed me and shouted loudly.
Hey everyone! Look who decided to show up, Mr. Low Education.
The restaurant buzzed with excitement, and all eyes turned to me.
I instinctively looked down. Why did I have to be humiliated by Mike at what was supposed to be a fun reunion? As I remained silent, Mike continued to hurl insults. This reunion isn't for someone like you with no education. Why are you even here? Mike approached me arrogantly. I could feel my body trembling with anger. Jacob, noticing this, couldn't stay silent. He shouted angrily. Mike, that's enough. Don't you know there's a line you shouldn't cross? You're 33 years old, for goodness sake. But Mike wasn't fazed by Jacob's words. Instead, he laughed. What I'm saying is the truth. This reunion is for elites. Mike then glared at me.
It's true that many of our classmates had high-paying jobs, but there was a better way to express it.
To make matters worse, Mike began to insult my parents.
Well, your parents were probably just as uneducated and useless.
The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. That was the last straw.
I couldn't understand why someone who didn't know my parents well would speak so poorly of them.
My parents are not useless. The one who's useless is you, Mike. What did you say? Mike's face turned red with anger, and his expression grew harsher.
Rachel, standing next to him, looked confused.
I didn't come to this reunion to see you, Mike. Seeing you is the last thing I wanted to do. Then why did you come? Because I have something to tell you. I glared at Mike. He laughed derisively. What could you possibly want to say? Are you going to ask for a job at my clinic?
Sorry, but we don't hire high school graduates.
Good grief. Mike is really a clueless guy. Sometimes, people like him need to be confronted with the truth. No, that's not it. I can tell you now, but are you sure you want to hear it? What the hell are you talking about? Just spit it out.
I took a deep breath and looked Mike in the eyes.
Mike, do you know someone named Jessica? Huh? Mike's face instantly turned pale. Everyone in the restaurant looked on curiously. I don't know anyone by that name.
Mike was clearly panicking.
Rachel, looking puzzled, asked Mike, who is Jessica? Mike insisted he didn't know her. Let me ask you again, are you sure you don't know her? I said I don't know her. How many times do I have to say it? I sighed.
At that moment, a loud voice echoed from the restaurant entrance.
How could you do this to me? You said you wanted to marry me. Who is this woman? Jessica. What are you doing here? Jessica had entered the restaurant.
Rachel, her eyes wide with shock, said, You told her you wanted to marry her?
What is going on? Mike, his face ashen, desperately tried to make excuses. Rachel, it's not like that. She's just a friend. I'm not just a friend. You said you loved me. That's why I lent you money. The venue was in an uproar. Everyone was watching the commotion, whispering about it. I never borrowed any money. It's all lies. Jessica began to cry at Mike's words. Rachel seemed to believe Mike. But I couldn't let him get away with this.
It was time to reveal the truth to everyone. Mike, you got engaged to Rachel while you were still engaged to Jessica.
Who do you think you are? Do you think you're a detective or something? You can't bring me down.
I handed Mike my business card. I work for a detective agency, and Jessica hired me to investigate your cheating.
What?
Yes, the woman who had just walked in was Jessica, my client. When she first came to our agency and showed me Mike's photo, I was shocked. But knowing Mike, it wasn't surprising, so I took on the case. Mike had promised to marry Jessica and borrowed a large sum of money from her, while also promising to marry Rachel and even meeting her parents. During my investigation, when my mother had a back injury, I purposely went to Mike's clinic. Around the same time, I received the invitation to the reunion and a call from Jacob.
Jacob informed me that Mike and his fiancée would be attending the reunion. I initially thought Jessica was the fiancée attending the reunion, but when I told her, she was surprised. I never heard about any reunion from Mike. I want to see who this other woman is.
Jessica's face twisted with anger. I decided to bring Jessica to the reunion to uncover the truth. I wonder how Mike will react if Jessica shows up at the reunion. There will be no way for him to make excuses anymore.
I believed so.
I thrust several photos at the stunned Mike, ready to get to the heart of the matter.
Rachel peeked at the photos too. The pictures showed Mike and Jessica in a close embrace.
The moment Mike saw them, he snatched them from me and tore them to shreds.
Rachel stared at Mike in disbelief. These are fabricated. All lies.
Even now, Mike was trying to escape the truth.
I sighed. Tell me the truth.
Rachel looked at Mike with a face that seemed on the verge of tears. Mike grasped her hand, desperately whispering, The only one I love is you, Rachel. Suddenly, a woman who had been watching the scene unfolded walked towards Mike.
It was Emily.
In middle school, she hadn't been particularly noticeable, but 15 years later, she had become quite beautiful.
Mike. You promised to marry me too, didn't you? So you were seeing 3 women at the same time?
Emily's words sent a wave of shock through the restaurant. Even I didn't know about this and couldn't help but do a double take at Emily.
Mike was visibly shaken, trembling uncontrollably. How many women have you deceived? I can't believe this. I'm breaking up with you. And you'd better repay all the money you borrowed. I'll be claiming damages too. Jessica stormed out of the restaurant in fury.
Rachel, now red-faced with anger, confronted Mike.
So you were deceiving me too? How dare you? I'm calling off the wedding. Goodbye. No. If the wedding is called off, I won't get the investment for my clinic. I'll make sure my father knows. The investment is off. Obviously. Rachel. Please, don't say that. Rachel said that and left the restaurant just like Jessica. Mike, in a panic, chased after Rachel and left the restaurant.
The restaurant fell silent.
Cheating scum. Lost all respect for him.
The room buzzed with condemnation of Mike's actions.
Some classmates were consoling Emily. Finally, justice is served. Indeed.
I was glad to have exposed Mike's true nature to everyone. Later, I handed Jessica the investigation report.
That awful man was not worth it.
I'll be claiming damages as soon as possible, she said, smiling. Eventually, Mike ended up paying a substantial amount in damages to Jessica, Rachel, and Emily. News of Mike's deceit spread throughout the town, and his clinic had fewer and fewer patients. With the clinic struggling to stay afloat, Mike had to take out significant loans, but eventually, he couldn't keep up and had to close the clinic. On the last day, Mike was reportedly bawling his eyes out in a pitiful display. This was the result of his actions. I hope, even though it might be too late, that Mike never repeats his mistakes and lives without causing trouble for others. Today, as always, I continue my work as a detective, helping those in need.